So basically, this class is about the thing called template culture, and I will start by speaking about. Of course, template culture is a contemporary like state of affairs, but I will give like at the beginning a historic overview of what it is, and also maybe like more general insight into what can be taught of templates and all that kind of stuff. And of course, the beginning of templatization, if one may say so, is the invention of standards and standardization. But let's start with basically a general question, and well, here we can have you can chip in if I would ask you, what do you think are standards, or what are they for? What comes into your mind? Anyone? You can just say whatever you think. Ilya, what do you think?
I think that standards make our lives easier, because
Sure.
like we have some rules which we follow, and like the whole processes are when they are standardized, so like it's much easier to live, I think.
Yeah, that's a good answer. Hassan, what do you think? What if I would ask you, like, what would be like if you would think like the most general, or let's say the most basic or primitive, like, or perhaps like the first instance of when some kind of a form of standardization became apparent? What would come to your mind? Hassan? Am I pronouncing your name right? Hassan? No? The
I'm trying.
Oh, you're thinking. Okay.
No. I was trying to unmute myself.
Oh, okay. Cool.
Sorry.
No worries.
But in terms of standardization, the first thing that comes to my mind is just paper.
Sure.
And maybe the lack of it, because like every country has like this different ratios and sizes.
Yeah, that's a good, but that's already like that comes to, if you talk about industrial standardization, like paper sizes and like proper standardization. But if you think of like, let's say if you think of about like primitive cultures or something like this, like the most basic in a
More
way.
Asian.
Yeah.
It's
Anyone?
almost everywhere, even like time zones.
Sure.
Even currencies.
Yeah, I think that's basically a good answer. It shows that the standardization processes are basically everywhere. I think what I was looking at, if you think of language, then this is basically one of the first forms of standardization. For instance, if you think of grammar, basically, or then these are standard rules for communication. And just like in contemporary graphic design, I can Google and look up what are the standard dimensions of a Facebook banner. If it comes to language, then we can pick up a dictionary and take a look at what is the standard word for bread, let's say, and and also the conjugation rules and things that come with it. And as we think of like design standards, then of course these change very rapidly. Whereas like the meaning of a word changes there are also very slow. But the main point is that like all standards, they are basically man-made. They're not how the word would be, like heaven sent or somehow graved into stone. So they always change, they evolve over time, but some of them are just more rooted in our everyday practices, so the changes there are very slow. whereas some change very rapidly, like Facebook banner standards, which they basically change every year or many times a year. Perhaps what should be mentioned here is also that if we talk about language, then it of course doesn't have to be always verbal language. It can be also if you think of what language is, it's basically a means of communication. So in that sense, we can think of everything that provides us a common ground for communications as some type of set of standards. And in that sense, we can realize that this doesn't have to be necessarily verbal language. It can also be like similar values, or for instance, similar needs. In that sense, if we talk about similar needs, then economy is definitely a standardization process. And especially if we look at ancient cultures, then it was quite often the case that tribes had a different language, but they had a common exchange of goods. They had, at least to some sense, a common economy. So in that sense, we could say that standards are something that's a common ground for communication, and it consists of many different things. It can also be like an etiquette, standard mode of behavior, and but of course that's not the the common idea of what we speak of when we think of standards, but we do understand that this is a part of standardization process. And in that sense, if we would want to make this kind of leap of thought, we might say of people in general, or humans in general, as standardization machines. Of course, this sounds a bit weird, but at the same time, we do understand that in order to communicate, we need at least some kind of a common ground, and which means that we need some kind of a standardized set, some kind of a the basic thing is basically words which are used by both parties in the same sense. Maybe I would just say also that if you have any questions, it is a presentation, but I don't mind if it turns into a seminar as well, which means that if something seems a bit fishy to you, or you want to add something, then please feel free to do it. Otherwise, I will continue that and language is also a very strong power tool, or sorry, not language, but language as well, but all types of standardization processes. They have become the basis of conquering and colonizing, and I don't mean this necessarily in a negative sense, in a sense of war and stuff like this. Quite often, I think that kind of a conquering and colonizing happens by itself in a way. And if we think of the, at the moment, I could say that we are very colonized by the English-speaking world. Even this lecture is in English, although we are in Estonian. And I can't say that this is necessarily a bad thing. It has its good sides and bad sides, like everything, I guess. So, but basically, who owns the standardization tools also owns the land or space, if you might say so. And this space doesn't have to be physical; it can also be a mental space, like we have. Perhaps we're talking about at the moment. We are living in a world that is very strongly connected to. We here in Estonia to Western values, Western culture, Western pop culture, so back and so forth. So, yeah. Maybe here is a good part to, time to talk about a little bit also about culture in general. The culture, the word actually comes from the word agriculture, to cultivate something like grow. And it was first used by Cicero, one Roman like philosopher or a rhetoricist, speech man, so to speak. And he used it in the sense of like cultivating a soul, a spirit, a spiritual way of life, so to speak. And culture. If we talk about like standards and everything else that if we talked about like this conquering and colonizing effect of the processes of standardization, then of course what sums it up in a way, the things that I was telling you earlier, that it can be the space that is conquered can be a mental space or it can be a physical space. It's summed up by basically a culture. We could say that although physically we are living in different lands, but we share a common culture between let's say, the Western world or something like this. And this definitely is a product of standardization. Standardization of, well, I guess it's already clear what I'm trying to say. It's also interesting to look into like the language used in old fairy tales, for instance, when they talk about culture. And this has been analyzed many times by people who study fairy tales, is how they divide space in two, basically. And usually these are completely opposite spaces in a way, that we have a cultured field, or the place that is cultured, which is like let's say the village, and then there is forest, which is the complete opposite, the chaotic place where magic things happen, the place is unexpected, and whereas we have the village, which belongs to a certain culture and to certain standards that we are used to. So in that sense, if we talk about standards, what I'm trying to say is that if we talk about standards, we should not necessarily think about it only in a very certain sense, in a sense that, for instance, the paper formats or any other kind of Facebook banners or whatever, any other kind of specific standards that we have at the moment. But we at first should think about it as a bigger process of standardization, which I would say is as old as, as people, as history itself, in a way. And here, I guess it's worth also mentioning again that most standards don't necessarily have a birth date. They are actually much closer to customs, habits, and traditions, which are basically ways of doing or ways of seeing and ways of being that have evolved over a very long period of time. So in that sense, just to sum this part up a little bit, is that the process of standardization, it's an essential part of human activities. The underlying function of language, basically, of culture and communication in general. So if you look up all the examples, if we talk about like contemporary notions of the implied culture and standardization, then I think this should all be kept in mind. Do you have any questions for now? Nope. So let's carry on. So basically, if we talked about at the moment about standardization in the most general sense. So now I'll give you an overview of standardization in the 20th century, which is basically the birthplace of of the standards that we are using at the moment. And also we might think of this only as standardization of industrialization or something that was part of industrialization to make the production more efficient. But at the same time, I hope through this part you will see that it's not only that, it's also basically the reinvention of the society that we live at the moment, shaping of this in society. through the process of standardization. Not only through the process of standardization, but the process of standardization is a very strong, had very strong implications in this process. So, and of course, as you can see already on the screen, whoops, oh yay. Then I'm gonna talk about modernism, and mainly about Jan Tschichold and his book, The New Typography. Some of you, the ECA students, are at least a bit familiar with the text. If you remember, we read bits and pieces of it in the first semester. So maybe some things are already familiar to you, but maybe not everything, or at least it's worth to go over it again. So basically, the need to standardize in the beginning of the 20th century was emergent, or it became emergent or necessary through the process of industrialization of Europe and the Western world in general. And here, I guess, we can reflect back on what Ilya and Hassan said, basically that it is a necessity in a way. It makes, well, maybe we just have to first think about what happened in the 19th century, or the boom of industrialization. Lots of factories were built, lots of stuff was produced, and but of course the production, sorry, I'm struggling with English a bit, it seems. The production, the amounts of production grew rapidly, so also, which means that the costs of production also grew, so that you had perhaps a little bit more at stake. So there was a strong need to standardize some production principles in order to basically save money. And of course, the paper size is the easiest example. So let's say if we have in every country, in bigger countries, perhaps in different cities, different paper types in use, then basically it would mean that you always have to adjust your machine, or maybe even build a new machine to produce a certain type of paper for a certain type of client. But if everybody uses the same formats, then you can just produce as much as you want and sell it to everybody who needs it. So in that sense, this is very cost effective, cost beneficial. So and the book, The New Typography, it was published in 1928, has basically comes out of that need, and it had, well, the main point of basically it was that it was a practical workbook for printers and designers. And the point was that quite often the case was that, well, basically like we have today, you have designers and then you have printers, or you have coders, people who don't, who are good, let's say, craftsmen, who know how to make things, whereas they perhaps don't know how to design them. And so in that sense, it happened quite often that designers were in the mercy of printers, print being the main design medium at the time. So you had a very good design in mind, but when you send it to the printer, then of course there's always lots of room for interpretation, how to use some kind of type sizes, whatever formats, materials, colors, and if you were not yourself as a designer also a printer, there always, was lots of room for errors. So basically this is a very practical book that Tschichold wrote. The idea was that to educate basically printers on certain principles that in his opinion should be more suitable for the contemporary world. The contemporary world being the industrial world, and it is in that sense his arguments are very on point, because he saw that the world is changing, that the world is more industrialized, whereas many printers perhaps who had grown up in a very craft-based, maybe a much older tradition of working styles than became available at the time. So and here I want to show you many or some of the, okay, maybe one more thing to mention is you can see from the table of content also how it's set up, that it's very practical. Basically every small detail you can look up, and how they basically make it. And here I wanted to show you some images as well. If you have not read the book or browsed it, then I uploaded a PDF of it also into our course folder, so you can check it out. I think it's a very, very good book. I would recommend everyone to read it, but of course you have to read it from the contemporary perspective. Of course, if he says that, wrong, don't design like this, then of course you cannot take this as the final truth. But just to understand how graphic material works, how some of the basic principles have not changed, in a sense that we still have to, when we design, have to think about the hierarchy of informations, in a sense that what kind of information is more important and what is less important, certain contrast relations between graphic material. And this book, I think it helps you understand how these things work. But at the same time, of course, don't take it as a Bible, take it as a discussion partner. Take from there, what you can use in your practice, and the rest you can just reflect upon. So I wanted to show you, it is full of several images and explanations why a certain design is false, or what's the right word, like badly designed, let's say so, and why some works are well designed. For instance, here we have an image of William Baumeister's work, invitation card, and he brings this as an example of reading order. So you start from here. Of course, this is the biggest, and it's also a good study of visual hierarchy. See, immediately you notice this, and of course it's designed even chuck in a certain order, that you the type size grows a little bit smaller or grayer. You have a certain elements that immediately draw attention to it, that if you read from here, you will reach here first, but not this part. Then, and also maybe, a good thing to mention is that while at the moment such things look a little bit, such a design looks a little bit old school, a bit like historic, at the time, if a design looked like this, it was almost completely avant-garde. The contemporary printers at the time were very reluctant towards these ideas of the new typography, and of course they didn't come from only Chichor. There was a whole crew, if one might say so, of the new typographers. That's how they called themselves. At the time they didn't call themselves, of course, modernists. This is an old name that we have, the later generations have given them to. The whole Bauhaus people, the Russian formalists, and everyone like this. So in that sense, the idea that it's even funny to think of, you see here a sans serif typeface, which at the moment we think that it's so beautiful, so clean. Some people think. Where at the time it was thought of as the ugliest thing ever, and that's why it's called grotesque in North America, because it looked grotesque. If you know what that word means, ugly, repulsive. It's so rough. There's no beautiful finesse to it. So, and here is a he compares these two basically invitation cards. That's the correct one, and that's the bad one. And he says centered layout using lightweight sans serif has no visual effectiveness and reaches typographic low for today. And that's also very interesting what he says, in a sense that, I mean, to some extent, you know, you see what he means. You know, if you compare these two, of course, this has very strong accents, so to speak. You know, certain places really catch your eye immediately, whereas here everything is basically gray. But at the same time, if I speak from my personal view, I actually really like this design. I think it looks pretty cool. But yeah, that aside, and it's also interesting what he says. He doesn't say what, like, if you read this sentence again, has no visual effectiveness and richness, a typographic low for today. It's interesting that he's always speaking about that, not that this design is bad for this or that reason, but it's unsuitable for the contemporary world, which is the industrialized world that he keeps in mind. So in a way that he's, you know, he's not just talking about design, he's talking about the whole worldview where the design has to fit in, or has to be in correlation to. Here is another nice example, an example of pseudo-modernist typography. The compositor has the idea of prefabricated foreign shape and forces the words into it by type, but typographic form must be organic. It must evolve from the nature of the text. So basically, also very interesting, he calls this pseudo-modernism, and yeah, that here the form, you know, we all know this saying form follows function, but here what he says is that function follows form, that the designer probably has just seen this somewhere, this new language of design, what the Bauhaus and the others were doing, and then has tried something out like this, but not really understanding it because it just presses the text into it. Whereas in the new typography by so to speak proper modernist, these elements were always used to, in a way, highlight a certain part of a text or create hierarchies. Like here, just like here, it's done just by text itself. That's also a nice example. It looks functional. First, wrong. It looks functional, but when examined more closely, we find it superficial and does not express the text. In the middle, it's very difficult to find where to go when reading. Certain forms of abstract painting, understood only superficially, have been used in this piece, but typography is not painting. So he, well, I guess you already understand that this is also this pseudo-modernism, that there is some kind of a, it looks like a constructionist piece of work or design or art. There are squares, circles, everything looks very, let's say, cool, but at the same time it's completely unfunctional, in his view at least. If you remember the last semester we were talking about, when we had the graphic design theory course, we were talking about critical design, and we were both talking about the notion of critical as critical just for the sake of cool design. Then I guess we could call this also critical design, or, you know, that it just takes the form of new typography or modernism, not really actually understanding it. So here, and another set of examples is quite important. We will talk about them a little bit later as well. Is the distinction between design that is, wait, what is this? I have forgotten to take this away. Well, which is between work that is either standardized or not designed, designed and standardized, and so forth and back. So here what he says is that this is a page. So basically, we could even say that what he calls that this page is not designed, whereas this page, it is designed, but it's not standardized. So you can see that it's not, the proportions are not as, the longer edge is not that long as we would have in A format. So it's some kind of a different format, but it's still designed, it follows the rules of new typography. Whereas here, what he says that we have a standardized format, standardized but not designed letterhead. And here you can read it later, like what are the things he kuidas on etteheitma inglise keeles, you know, sees as a fault in this piece of design. And here's another another example of a standardized letterhead. This one may be then perhaps in his opinion the ideal one, which is if this is designed but not standardized, if this is standardized but not designed, then this is standardized and designed as well. Now okay, so an important point that I wanted to make here is then to understand, if we talk about standards, is that that standards are meant as guidelines for design, not design itself, meaning that just like these, that if you use any kind of standards, then you still have to design the material. For instance, and here I would like to quote and show his work a little bit as well. David Carson, the postmodernist designer from the States from the early 90s, him and many others of that generation, of that school of design, were very critical of, let's say, the use of grids. And the main argument, or not the main argument, but one of the arguments that came up from there was that in their opinion, they said basically that they never understood the use of grids, or the idea that they had the opinion that many people thought that if you use a grid, then basically that designs the piece of work for you. And and this, of course, I think, if you think of these arguments by those postmodernists or David Carson, in a sense, they probably are true, because I would guess that they weren't really talking about, let's say, Jan Tschichold or the Swiss grid designers of the 50s, but rather for 80s and early 90s, the grids, use of grids had become very already established, and I would guess many designers, many local designers, use them very lazily, in a sense that they just put something in a grid and then thought that this is like a good design. Whereas if you look at the works of these guys, then of course it's grid based, but it's also very, you can see that there's lots of thought behind it, very well thought through compositions. So in that sense, if we come back to what standards are, whichever they are, then they should not be thought of a substitute for design, but rather a guidelines that can make a certain piece of design work easier. I have here some more of the images from David Carson. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him. I'm sure you are, actually. But just to show you what kind of work he did, and it's obvious from here that he wasn't a big gridnik, if one might say so. Here's a famous piece that he did. Well, he well, okay, I'll just say, I'm just thinking that maybe it's so trivial that I say, because perhaps you already know it, but he was a surfer guy from the States. He never really had any design education, so he just started designing this ray gun, this pop culture surfer magazine, and he did many crazy things there. For instance, this is an article Yeah, unfortunately, I didn't find a good quality image of it, but it doesn't matter. You see the layout and stuff. So he was very free with typographic material. This is one famous piece. It's you can't see him, but it's an interview with Brian Ferry from the band Roxy Music, and he set the whole interview in wingdings. And well, I think it's in a way it's crazy because you can't read the interview, but there's a statement for that kind of a generation of people. I guess it was maybe even more informative, more communicative than an actual words of Brian Ferry. And here you can see some other, well, it's super grainy, but you can still see the layouts and how he used them. And definitely for a proper modernist designer of the late 20th century, this would be complete, useless work. So and if we come back, well, okay, basically, we can stay here as well. So a couple of more things that I wanted to say about the standards is that they can make the work of a designer much easier, but that's not always the case, and rather it's the case with well-designed and thought-through standards. While clumsily designed standards become actually useless limitations, they become a cage. And I guess this becomes very oh yeah, now I want it comes very apparent when we think about identity design, like corporate identity or nowadays, whatever kind of identity it might be. When we encounter, I'm sure maybe you don't know yet, but every designer, I'm sure, at some point encounters work of that they have to somehow work with some kind of identity. They have to follow the identity guidelines, but you realize that this is a very badly designed identity. So you're actually, it restricts you more than it creates opportunities. Whereas a good identity should be such that it's clear enough, the guidelines are clear enough, and in that sense, but not too restrictive, so that they would create, good opportunities for good design. And in that sense, we should, if we talk about a little bit more about identities, which basically are a standardized set of a set of standards how of graphic, how to use graphic material in a certain context of a corporation, for instance, and in that case, we also have to think what's the point of it? It's rather similar to what was the idea behind the new typography. Well, the new typography was supposed to educate, so to speak, the printers. Then identity guidelines, or brand books as they're called, or CVIs, also, are quite often done because companies don't have the means to hire a designer all the time. So the rules have to be clear enough for non-designers to apply as well. So if you see if you pass these rules on to a secretary, for instance, that they could make a proper letterhead. And here we have again the table of content of the new typography. And if you look at this, then actually this looks exactly like a brand book. I have here an example of the Estonian Academy of Arts, a few pages from the Estonian Academy of Arts CVI, and you can see the same here. Fontide kasutamise hierarchy of using fonts. It's pretty similar to what we have here. How to type poster, business card, etc. So in that sense, in this process of modernization, we can see many, already standard design, basically jobs or elements that they have grown out of these standardization practices, which at the first were super practical, mainly for specialists, printers and designers, to make their cooperation easier. Now, that kind of approach can be applied to many other things, as identities and so forth. Let's see what we have here. Okay, so interesting thing to also keep in mind is about Jan Tschichold and his the new typography. That so this book is written before the Second World War, and it was but after the war he actually rejected everything that he had written in the book. He rejected the new typography, and he basically went back to classical typography. He started making rather classic layouts. Sometimes, of course, they were a mixture of these two. You could see some elements of new typography or modernism in there as well. He also designed very classic serif fonts at the time. But here again, it's very interesting. His reasons for rejecting the new typography. Basically, he saw this as, he was a man who had to flee Germany during the Second World War. He went to Switzerland. He lived there and worked there till the end of his life. So, in no means he was a Nazi sympathizer, and he saw the new typography also as having a tendency towards authoritarianism, or like having similar universal tendencies like like Nazis were having, in a sense that this new typography prescribes only one very certain way of how typography should be done, and he realized that that's perhaps not a good thing to do. And maybe this is also something that comes back to if I talked earlier, I recommended you reading this book, then I think that's the main thing to keep in mind. That's the contemporary view to this material, that we should not take this as a Bible, as that's exactly how it should be, because then I think it it becomes meaninglessly violent if we would somehow I don't know, tear down posters that are not designed in this manner. It would also be ridiculous, but that doesn't mean that there isn't any value in this book. I think there's lots of important things there, but it's all context sensitive, in the sense that there are many things that are not universally true, but it doesn't mean that in some certain cases they might be very useful. And another thing is also is what came after him, in a way. Actually, the new modernism, new typography, his book, it's very precise, but it's also kind of rough. Then it was such like a principle-based design, systematic approach to design. In the 50s, it was developed much further in Switzerland. One of the leading guys is Josef Müller-Brockmann. He wrote this book, Grid Systems. I don't know if you have read it. We have it in the department, but of course now nobody can go there. So I uploaded the PDF of this book as well in our course folder. While Tschichold doesn't really speak about grids, then this book is all about that. Yeah. Maybe just to say something more. Maybe I'm already repeating myself, but what the hell? I've always thought of this, the new typography and the whole early modernism as a kind of uh, a zeitgeist type of thing. You could say that this is like a search for the perfect grid to solve all design problems, and that's the kind of approach that happened basically everywhere in that time in European culture, in art, in philosophy, in literature. That the bright-minded thinkers were trying to invent very universal problems that in their mind would solve basically, everything. But of course, through history, we have realized that this is basically probably impossible. It would always almost, turn into a Lord of the Rings type of joke. I have this. I remember this joke about Helvetica, which is also like the main modernist font. At least it became so for the for the late modernist, for the Swiss designers. The idea that, they had the idea that you must use only, not that you must use, but basically that one good font is sufficient. If you have one good font, you can do all the designs with it. And of course, the best font at the time for them was Helvetica, so you should use this. And then, if you remember this joke from the Lord of the Rings, not joke, this rhyme from the Lord of the Rings, saying that one ring to rule them all, and in the darkness bind them. So, to illustrate perhaps what Chichold meant by this, that this kind of approach can become demonic or fascist, is that the demand that we have only one font becomes something similar that a Sauron would say, that one font rule them all and in the darkness bind them. Okie doke. Okie doke. So, do you have any questions at the moment? No? Cool. It's funny for me to talk because I have like a full screen share, but you see all the images, right? No, somebody has to say because I don't see you. Yeah, cool. And so I don't see your faces because I only share the full screen. So it's an interesting way. I feel like I'm talking alone in my room, which is also cool. Which is also what I do regularly. And no, I don't. Okay. Okay, so the next part is basically, now if we understand the foundations of contemporary standardization, what were the cultural implications of this process? And as you can see, the three main things are perhaps like ideology behind it, which I already have a little bit talked about, and then authorship and what does it mean for work in general. And so maybe just a little bit more about modernist ideology. You can see here the new worldview is underlined. Basically, the book is in two parts. One is more like a more general explanation of what the new typography is, basically, but it's very interesting in a sense if you think of it. He talks about what the new typography is, but then it's not only typography, it's the new world, the new art, the new history, the new people. So it's very revisionist and revolutionary, as you can see over here. And that means, the revisionist means that they were trying to rebuild the society that they were living in. And also, in a way, revolutionary, that they were trying to, overcome the old world and you know, I'm just looking at my notes for a second if I missed something. And the best thing is also that the ink on my printer has run out, and of course I cannot really. Well, maybe I could, but I don't want to go to a shop to get it refilled. So my notes look very gray. I can barely read them, but it's okay. Oh yeah, in a sense that they don't see it just as a that design is something that we just do for business, but they saw it as a way of life, and you can see the ideology behind it in a way is the modernist approach to the contemporary world. They really think that if these design standards are set into place, then the world will become a better place. And to some extent it perhaps even will. If you think of this, I mean, the idea was that by making the print process better, we can print more, we can print it cheaper, we can also sell books cheaper, which means that more people get access to them, which means that more people will read books, more people will be educated. So in that sense it was a very humanitarian approach to to the world. Okay, yes, and an interesting maybe thing to also throw your attention to is the fact that when I talked about them being revisionists and revolutionaries, then it's a very interesting situation where they were in the beginning of the 20th century. So basically, the revolution that they had in mind, it was not a revolution that we should, tear down the old world and then build a new world instead of it. Rather, it was a revolution where they wanted to take the blinds off the contemporary man, saying that, look, the new world was already there. In a sense, it didn't really need a revolution. It didn't need someone to bring it over. It was already there. The processes of industrialization had been already going on for a couple of hundred years. They had risen a kind of peak for at the time, and so in that sense, what they were saying was that that makes you understand when they say something like over here that ding 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 that this is a typographic law for today, meaning that we don't have to design anymore like this. We have the machines to make it better. So in a sense, the future that they envisioned was already there. Their idea was just to show people, to make people aware of it in a way. So it's a very interesting revision or revolutionary in that sense. In that sense, we could say that they were ahead of its time, but at the same time, it's not true. They were exactly at this moment, and other people were just a little bit behind, if that makes sense. Yeah, so in that sense, it's interesting to keep in mind that whatever the shortcomings of a certain modernist project or a designer or a certain modernist book, that they had written, or certain modernist principles, at the same time, the new world was already there. There was basically no going back. So in that sense, they had already won. The matter was only to basically revise these principles and make them more suitable to people. So that's maybe an overview of the you know, the ideology of modernism, of the new typography, the new typography and Jan Tschichold. And this, of course, like I said previously, it didn't happen only in print. It happened everywhere in the arts, also in art. If you were in the arts, also in art, also in visual art, let's say. But also in theory. I don't know if you have read this text. Have you read it? Has anyone read it? I presumed if okay. I thought that if you're all quiet, then I presumed that you have all read it, because silence means agreement. Just a joke. So, but I'm sure many of you have heard of the book. Well, it's more of an essay, but it has been published as a book as well. This here is a cover of the book from Penguin Books. So it's a very influential, very famous text by Walter Benjamin, and well, he says many other things in it, but I think one of the things that he, in a way, predicts or sees clearly at the time, well, this book is basically, this essay is written in 1935, so 17 years. Oh, sorry, I didn't have the year written here of new typography. I'll look it up. So, well, basically, doesn't matter. Around 15 years after the new typography. So you can think of what kind of like processes in culture, all this, the cultural avant-garde has led to these ideas. If it basically take the cultural avant-garde and put it in the industrialization, then you reach the ideas that Walter Benjamin was thinking. So he was maybe one of the first ones to put this together. Of course, he was not the first one to put this together, but he was one of the first ones to articulate this very eloquently. And so what he speaks about is how the work of art, or basically art in general, or a piece of art, has changed in the 20th century. He speaks about this a concept called aura, and the loss of it in the contemporary world. Previously, a work of art was always connected to a specific time and place when it was made, also an author, whereas now we have works of art that are machine made. He also talks about photography, how this replaces basically the landscape painting, the genre of landscape paintings. We don't really need people very precisely painting landscapes. We can just take a photo. And the so okay, so basically what he predicts or talks about are all the processes in a way that took root in art at the time, a little bit earlier, and also, have become a kind of standard today, which is automation, reproduction, already mentioned photography, the ready-made art, and in that sense the piece of art has really gained a new status. And here, that's also a moment when design and art become much more closer. Design belonging much more to the realm of pop culture and low culture, so to speak. And design, it becomes a means of producing high culture art, basically. And in return, art, one might say, if you're a romanticist, that art becomes devalued. But if you're maybe someone like a modernist, then you might say that art actually gains something by this. by becoming more contemporary, closer to pop culture vernacular. We all already know about pop art, for instance, and also how what the industrialization does to the contemporary world, or the contemporary art world, is that it blurs the lines between high and low culture, makes them much more fluid. And this has also led to the question of authorship. This is something that was also developed by other thinkers, maybe a little later in the 60s, by Michel Foucault and Roland Barthes. They wrote several articles on this topic. The most famous, perhaps, by Roland Barthes, entitled "The Death of the Author." I'm sure many of you have heard of that text as well, if you've not already read it, or maybe, in some lecture somebody has told you. I guess these are all texts that are, I would say, must read for understanding contemporary art and culture. Texts that have had a very strong influence. And speaking about how we think about authorship of a specific work. And this has also very interesting implications to design, because design usually has been, in opposition to art, that is also always, or has been always, very, author-centered craft. While designers have always been, now the situation has to somewhat changed a little bit. I don't know if it's a good change or not. Quite often it even looks silly, but doesn't matter. But design has always been this transparent craft, closer to a printer, somebody who takes up the role of a mediator, somebody who can communicate the ideas very well, but the ideas are usually not the designers, so they are not really the author, and so back and so forth. But of course, this again is not true, because if you open up a book of design history, then all we see is talk of this and that author, basically. So yeah, but the tendency, of course, is there, and also the tendency how designers perceive themselves, be them historic or contemporary designers. Well, me personally, I can also say I've had the chance that some writers have wanted to write my name in the book, something that, if they like the design very much, then they want to say something like, "Hey, can I write that this is your art or something?" Then I've always been very reluctant towards it, because that's not really something that I associate with myself. Even though the work might be very somewhat specific or very close to art, it doesn't mean that it's art by itself. And this has also very strong implications that come up in basically contemporary situations of design or graphic design especially. I mean, the authorship, which has become again very actual when we talk about piracy and the freedom of information, where basically in the World Wide Web everything is I wouldn't want to say the word free, but free to grab, so to speak, free to use. But I won't speak too much about it at the moment. I will come back to it a little bit later. I was also wondering, did you browse through the text that I sent you? Some were also links in the in the PDF.
A bit.
Cool. Then, sorry, what? A hero.
I read the shorter text, or like the text articles, and not the text.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, of course. The book was that one, right? The same one, this one, the Walter Benjamin. But it doesn't matter. Anyway, it, it's okay. It doesn't really matter. I'm digressing. The idea was just this: that in the shorter ones, the text that I also send you with the email, they talk very much about basically authorship for graphic for design, and what does it mean in the what does work mean in general. If we think about that word in the design today, but we'll come back to this a little later. Or just maybe to mention, if we talk about work, the you know what we spoke there, the automation of the design work that's written in the text. But I have the feeling we discussed this a little bit also in last semester. Of course, we didn't do it with the Erasmus students because you weren't there. But if you look through the text, you get the image of what I'm talking about. Yeah, so basically that's yeah. Well, this slide should have been already there when I started talking about the situation of work today. Basically, the image that you see here comes from a logo generator. So, I mean, I guess the question is, or the thing that many designers think about, or theoreticians of designers, what will the work of a graphic design look in, let's say, 100 years? Or perhaps we don't even have to look that far. We can think of like 15 years, 20 years. If we see the tendencies that come up, which is standardization of many design processes. And this, in a way, is also one of the main topics of the course as well. If we think about like stock material, templates, even mock-ups, then these are all tools that make our work easier and make it automatic, but also in a way change the way we work drastically. So it begs the question, what kind of skills does one need if, let's say, big chunk of your work is actually generated? Okay, so enough of history. Now we're getting to the contemporary situation. So what, you know what, I'll have a sip of water for a second. I should have this like elevator music while I do something else. Okie dokie. So the standards. So in contrast with the talk that I was just speaking about, the early hopes and dreams of standardization of modernism, it's rather interesting, you know, how much, like hope was put on this process. Like I said, in a way, they won because lots of standards are already in place. But of course, with the World Wide Web, things have changed drastically. Like we talked a little bit in the earlier, I mentioned how, you know, the meaning of a word, the standard meaning of a word changes rapidly. And I really mean the standard meaning of the word. I think this also means that, you know, if you take the example of bread, then bread means it means the actual, you know, loaf of bread. But this is the standard meaning. In addition to this, words have many different, you know, many other meanings as well. You know, if you listen to, I don't know, rap music. If we bring in slang or dialects or whatever, the rappers rap all the time about bread, but what they really mean is money and stuff like this. So, so just an example of. I thought that maybe it's counterintuitive if you talk about standard meanings of a word. And if we talked about the how the meaning a word changes very slowly, but how, for instance, much newer standards change very rapidly. They're constantly in construction, and of course this is the case with the World Wide Web, which, if we look at the history of mankind, is a very recent development. Printing, of course, is also a recent development, but at the same time, it has a much longer history, maybe 300 years or something like this, I guess, or maybe even older. So it's constantly redeveloped. Who knows when we will reach a steady World Wide Web, and who knows if we would even want to have a steady World Wide Web. But basically, there are several tendencies going on with standards and the contemporary world. One of them being that there's a constant war of standards. And now we go back to the thing that we talked earlier about, is how standardization is also a process of colonization and conquering a certain space. If we took a look, if you think of global companies, then of course there's a constant economic battle over markets. And I have this joke basically that we have a template culture, but we also have that we are the generation dongle, which means that I personally have always a small bag with me where I have 3 or 4 different small wires that for all types of emergencies when I might need them. And this of course is the source or is the mirror image of the contemporary situation of the war between basically standardizations. Who gets to you have your own plugs, so by or speaking more generally, by making your own standards, you also make a certain homogenic land, and by not creating this common ground that we talked about in the beginning that allows communication, you keep the people in your land. And now if we come back from this metaphor, it all comes down to, if we talk about global companies to economics, you keep them in your economic circle, and so in that sense, there is this tendency. Another thing, another comparison that I wanted to draw is also, if we talked about that a certain aesthetic comes with this, so to speak, standardized web, then it's perhaps the situation is rather similar to what was going on in the pre-modernist times. Basically, the situation that the modernists came and started to clean up. And in the 19th century, the field of graphic design was a complete mess. And if you look at some examples, I don't know if this is 18th or 19th century, but basically we all know these old posters. I can't remember what was the typographic period before modernism. If someone you remembers, maybe you can tell me. I have forgotten it. But basically, this. If you compare this to what Jan Tschichold was doing, then of course this is a complete mess. And if you think about it in terms of contemporary web design, then it's also this is crazy. if I would see such a web page or an advertise in online, I could not read it. But of course, when it was published, the situation was of course completely different. Now we have overflux of information. At the time, it was, underflux of information. So if you go to, like we have still in countryside, you have some kind of information board, and you have 10 of these posters, then it's perhaps to some extent graspable. And the question is also, for modernists, of course, of functionality. And I guess we all do understand what the problem is here, but don't think that this is not the case. That this is like it's at the same time very interesting graphic material. I think these posters actually look very beautiful, especially this one. It's crazy, and also look at this font is very beautiful as well. There was some. Look at this one. I would buy that. And the idea is basically, these old, wanted or saloon posters. Basically, they're a gold mine for every type designer who's interested in revivals. Basically, I would be very interested in if some designer would redraw this font. So use it now. So basically, in a way, what I was trying to say was this, that the situation perhaps was kind of similar to the pre-modernist times. Also that it was a time when print was already had been going on for several time, so it had reached some standards, but of course, they weren't really, they were more close to, commons, not commons, habits or some traditions, the way things were done, but nobody had ever really taught them true in a way. So in that sense, in web design, we have perhaps a similar situation. Of course, in some sense, completely different, but I'll come to this in a second. So the idea was basically that we do have standardized web pages. Definitely this web page, we can see that it's based on a grid. It's probably designed on a certain web template. But if we now think back to these funky examples, standardized but not designed, then I think it's the same case that the contemporary web, quite often it is standardized, which means that it uses a certain standard backbone, a template, but quite often it is not necessarily designed. Okay. And then if we talk about these, the trinity of this course is basically templates, mockups, and stock visuals. Then maybe just quickly go over them, what they basically are. I guess most of it is self-evident, but just to have it on the table. So templates are mostly referred to in the web context, web templates, and basically a pre-designed website where a client can add their own content, text, and images. But of course, it's not only the case nowadays. Rarely web designers start a website from scratch. They usually use some kind of a template for a base. And in here, we can see the situation is kind of similar that we talked about identities, that quite often they are meant for non-designers. And in that sense, they have to be very well, written. The instructions have to be very clear so that designers could use them. I mean, the idea here, I mean, if you look at something like this, I think it's very, this web page is very similar to something like this, or perhaps even something like this, which is that they try to take maximum out of this space. As many ads as possible, because who knows, maybe one of them you will finally click. Whereas here it seems to be the same case that well, nowadays, of course, we understand how posters work. You probably just put a big title and then a little bit information where you can, you know, a web page perhaps or something like this, and then you from a web page or something like this you get all the other information. Whereas at the time the situation was completely different. All the information had to be presented there and now because there was no extra material. So it's a bit similar here, trying to take the maximum of the medium, put as much as possible over there. Maybe I'll mention one more thing, which is the I have a question. Do you have another class coming up now? At some point today?
No.
Oh, okay, very good. Because I realized that I've been talking already for almost an hour and a half, so that, okay, but I'm almost finished, so. But then I can allow myself one more digression, which is the, if we talk about vernacular design, I'm sure you know what that means, like the quite often the unprofessional amateur design. And there's a very interesting text in a talk by Clara Balauguer. She is from a design collective called Hardworking Good Looking. Basically, I can put the link to you somewhere as well if you want to. And they are Filipino designers living now in Europe and the States. But they come from they're born in the Philippines, and their whole design practices evolves around engagement with Filipino design. And of course, they don't really have any strong, let's say, you know, design culture that comes from a modernist background. It's much more hands-on, much more, you know, print-based people design who just, you know, try to make money out of it, not that they're professionals necessarily. And there, of course, when you look at the design, it's also, you know, if you take this to be a paper, then it's completely filled with information. And coming from a modernist background, we would think that this is crazy, you know, we can't understand anything. But of course, you know, they say very nicely that over there, the thing is that the paper is expensive. If you go and print something, that's also expensive. People are poor, they don't have too much money. So basically, if you leave white space on a page, then it's basically a wasted money. So if you go and print something, you want to take the maximum out of it. So you print as much as you can, basically you put as much information as you can. So I would say that something similar is going on here. I'm not saying this is good or bad, but I think this is like a glue to understand it. And I think this actually, maybe we'll come to this a little later as well, that, you know, if we talk about values, you know, if this design is good or bad, then, you know, I wouldn't say if it's good or bad, but I would say that it's definitely interesting. It's a new form of, like a contemporary form of visuals. We encounter it every day, and we as, you know, people who are specialized in visual culture should take this kind of a material seriously, look at it, try to understand it, you know, understand why it's there. Templates. The other thing is stock visuals, and I on purpose put stock visuals, although stock photography is of course the main stock sold, you know, main thing in stock. But then of course nowadays it's very common to have like vector objects and other graphic visuals. I'm talking about like 3D pictures are also when you put into a stock bank like something like genetics or something abstract like I don't know deepness whatever, then you usually get some kind of a like photoshopped color images. So which are designed by somebody, not photographed by somebody. So in that sense, you have the different type of stuff over there, and mhm. And with stock materials, I think the question of work and authorship becomes very interesting in a way, because although most stock materials are not royalty free, you have to pay them. This is someone's work. Seldom people, don't care about it. I mean, it's just the access to these materials became so simple. When we think about, I'll ask you a question. What do you think is the biggest stock? And this is a bit like a trick question. What do you think is the biggest stock image platform? Just whatever you think.
Stockshare.
Stock share?
Stock photo.
Yeah. Anything more?
Getty Images.
Yeah. Very good answers. But yeah.
Shutterstock for life.
Yeah, exactly. But I think actually the main one is Google Images, because it's and I mean this in the sense that Google Images is not a platform that is specialized on on selling stock photographs or any other stock visuals, but the way we people access them, or download them, I think is mainly through this, because I think I'm pretty sure I don't have any facts. Maybe I should have looked it up, but I think most, or not, sorry, definitely not most, but a big chunk, maybe half or even more, of stock material
But
is.
You can search Google Images, so you only find non-copyrighted, or so it's like free to use, so you can easily just like download them and not to worry about like paying the license.
Exactly. Yeah. So in that sense, I think actually the Google image search is one of the biggest stock platforms, but in the sense that not that it's like a specifically stock platform. It's a platform, but in that sense, it is that it's the place where we get most stock material or get access to them. Well, yeah, just to mention as well that maybe I already said it, I can't remember anymore, that it has the strong implications to authorship, something that we talked about in terms of art and stuff like this as well, that it has completely changed in that sense. And it's interesting how these changes are very they happen very unnoticeably, in a sense. And what I mean here is that because there's so much free stuff, so to speak, on internet that we can download, and it's legal, but there's also lots of illegal stuff, but it's also as easily downloadable as the free stuff. Then I think the fact that all this information is just one fingertip away, it kind of, and if this situation has gone already for, let's say, 15 years or 10 years, then it changes something in us. We start to think of images as a freeware, basically. Of course, we know that that's not the case, but this kind of like a general thought of you know that there is always a free image that you can use as well. So yeah, it's kind of a interesting change that would have been impossible, let's say in 91 or something like this. Let's see how it changes the genetics of designers in a million years. Dumb joke. Okay. Let's see, stock visuals. Oh yeah, and the almighty mockups. So mockups are interesting in the sense that while stock visuals and templates are almost the ready product, then mockups are usually like design specific, in the sense that they are for showing your work, as it would be, to show your. I mean, that doesn't even need to be explained basically, but when I do a poster, then to show how it would actually look on a wall, to see it a bit more in the actual context. And in graphic design, we also, we know what the mockups are, but it's also very common, also, let's say standard in product design or whatever, where you basically make, or architecture, where you make a, it's in English, maquette. You make like a small model of a thing, whereas mockups are well, they're basically the same thing, but in graphic design we have used to think of them as images, whereas they can also be 3D, in 3D, not 2D like we have here. Wait. Okay. Maybe I wanted to mention one more thing about this. I lost some kind of a paper of mine, but it doesn't matter. So the use of mockups also has, like, all these, let's call them technologies, basically have created. They always create. They have a certain function which is prescribed, but of course people use them for many different things. Interesting things. I think that's something common that has happened nowadays. When you see a work online, due to the high quality of mockups, you never really know if a work is actually made, or if it's just a mockup, or if it's a mockup of an actual thing, or if it's just made for the sake of showing a piece of work that was maybe actually never realized. And I remember from a friend once said that she had this situation that she made a pseudo book of some kind of like a World War II images, and she put the book pages into a mock-up and uploaded it online. And then a little while later, she got an email from the website It's Nice that they were very interested in the book, and they would like to know more about it, and they would like to write about it. And so I think there's lots of stuff like, of course, that friend of mine actually declined. I mean, she said that yeah, sorry, that's actually a fake book. And then she proposed something like that she would write, or they would do an interview about this fake stuff and why it's done, why she did it in the internet. But I think that was something that It's Nice that was not really interested in. Anyways, so yeah, it creates these illusory effects in a way, but also what comes with standardization and mockups and stuff like this is that they become a medium in itself, which means that they they become. If we spoke earlier that standards in the context of Jan Tschichold, that standards are not they're not the design but a guideline for a designer, then it's very interesting how the massive use of mock-ups has created a certain change, because they have become designing the posters themselves as well, in a sense that I don't mean like necessarily what is over, printed or designed over here, but if you put, if you see these posters on the mock-ups, they start to look the same in a way. The lighting is the same. You see many mock-ups used several times. So and in that sense, these two things look kind of similar. And you see, some kind of it becomes a design aesthetic itself. The way you show your work, the way the work is, shown, the way it looks, in what setting is it shown. Yeah, so this is one of the things that comes with it. Again, I have no answer if this is a good or a bad thing, but it's something that we should, be aware of, that this is happening. Okay. And maybe one more thing to, well, we kind of already talked about it, but the situation that we are at the moment, the so to speak template culture, what we talked about, if I talked about the idea that we start thinking of creative work as something that is free, basically. I mean, it's also, if you think about music and downloading music, now it has changed a little bit due to Spotify, so people don't actually download that much music. But I think many people don't even think that music is something that you should pay for. And pay for, you might pay, a little bit. I use Spotify Premium, so I pay like, I don't know how much it is, 15 euros or 10 euros a month. That's not too much. I think it's completely fine. But if you think about back a few years, then 15 euros was the money you paid for one record. And if I would have to do this, nowadays, I'm old enough to remember these times, and it was completely, standard behavior, if I may say so. But now, if I would have to do it, I would, I would be very angry, and I would be very poor, because I would buy a lot of records probably, or at least I would listen to much less music. So in that sense, I'm already used to the thought that music is something that is always there. I can always approach it. And the same thing has come to my approach of, visual material. That it's always there. I can always get it. If it comes to stock material, I know that I can always get it. And if I really need it, I can pay a little, if I have the money, or if my client has the money. But it's never the case that, it doesn't exist in a way, or that I have to somehow, even the thought that I have to make it myself is sometimes foreign. And this actually, again, is a pure product of the World Wide Web. If you think about the enthusiasm of the World Wide Web that, was among coders and hackers and web enthusiasts in the 90s, when the World Wide Web was taking baby steps, then, these were exactly these ideas, that freedom of information, piracy as, something that brings information to everyone. And now if we look back at modernism and Jan Tschichold and all these guys that we were talking about previously, that these are actually exactly the same thoughts. They saw the same possibilities in print. That books are not some kind of things that only very privileged class or privileged, rich people can afford. The books are something that everybody can have, and that's what happened exactly. Mass market paperbacks, super cheap, everybody can afford them, and it's great. And the same thing with now with internet, the freedom of information. But at the same time, again, what I'm talking about here, it should be taken always value free. I mean, I'm not in a position to say if one thing is good or bad, I'm more like spectator. Maybe that's not the right word, but just like at the moment I'm just describing the contemporary situation, and I wouldn't say that it's good or bad, but it's different, and it's again just something that we have to be aware of. Okey-doke. Okay, and now we're close to the end now, so bear with me. Okay. Oh yeah. If you go back to the beginning of this presentation, now it sounds more like a lecture, I would say, of this presentation. Then, if you try to think of the template culture, what are templates in the most broadest sense? The same way that we were thinking about in the beginning about standards in the most general sense. What can we think of as a standard, or what are the parts of our everyday lives where we can see instances of standardization, and when we if you put on these glasses, then you can basically see instances of standardization everywhere. And then if we would do the same thing with if we think about template culture, then what can it actually be? And maybe we don't even have to think about what's the most basic form of templatization, because I think maybe that's the same thing as the most basic form of standardization. But then if we think of we have these three instances of template culture: the web template, the stock visual, and the mock-up. And now we think of what else can be a template, or if we put on these classes, what else can we see as having an instances of templatization, crazy word, inside them? Then what would that be? And that's the text. Perhaps you recognize. It's come from a text that I wrote several years ago for the Estonian art magazine. The text was called "Aesthetics of Information Waste," and it was about basically how low resolution images have become the new currency, or how I'm talking there about web trash, basically all this, or web vernacular, I would say, basically all these kind of things that we see every day, but we don't really pay attention to them because we think of it as something useless. It's basically like it's like trash on a street corner. When you go to a web page like this, you try to avoid that section of the page very strongly. As when you walk on a street that is trashy, you don't go rumbling in it. You try to stay on the clean path, so to speak. So, this text is a first attempt by me to somehow try to value it, make sense of it. I'm not saying it's actually. I'm not sure if it's a good text. It's 2 or 3 years old, so it doesn't really matter. But I think it's a good, maybe like a first step to to think about these things. So if you start thinking what memes could be, there's an answer already. What the templates could be, then definitely memes are I think a very strong part of template culture. And if you think of how they function, I mean, basically the same as mockups or web templates. Seldom people make memes themselves. Some freaks do, of course. But you usually go to a meme generator, and you already know the 20 most popular meme images, and you just insert your own text there. I mean, it's basically the same as you do with a web page template. you get, we already know which kind of a website, the basic types there are. Like there's the portfolio type, there's the web shop template, and whatever. So you choose one, and then you insert your own text there, and voila, you have it. So memes basically function in the same way. Or also the same thing is with mockups. We know that there's this poster mockup, there is this t-shirt mockup, whatever. So you download it and you use it. So in that sense, it's the same functions, I would say. It's free. It's a design tool, but it doesn't really need almost any professional knowledge of what design is, or any design programs, or how to design. You basically have to have a basic English skill. Sometimes not even this. So yeah, and also, so these are just several ideas, what we can think of as templates. And another thing is, which I am very interested in, is wait, let me see. Oh yeah. So memes, definitely a strong factor of template culture. But another thing that I am a big fan of actually is eBay, and in Estonia we have Osta.ee and these platforms. And these, I think, are crazy stock image platforms. So we're gonna do a small experiment now. I'm gonna oops, wait. Gonna get out of here. Like this. Okay. Are you with me?
Yes.
Cool.
Yep.
So we're gonna do small experiments. We're gonna go to eBay. And eBay, just like I said, that we can think of Google as a stock image platform. I think eBay is a very interesting stock image platform. If I go to a, that's a bit annoying. If I go to a regular stock platform, the images all look the same. I immediately get bored with them. I mean, they have a certain function, and sometimes in my design work as well, I might need them. But mainly there's, if you go there, you already know what is there. Basically, you know already how they look like. And of course, this is the strong side of them. This is also a form of standardization, that you know what you're going to get, the certainty that a standard provides. There is even this saying, I can't remember where I read this from, but somebody said that this is also one of the principles of stock imagery, that when you see a stock image, then you know that it's a stock image. That they have a certain aesthetic in that sense. But eBay and all such other such platforms are very interesting for me, because they continuously have provided me imagery that is very surprising for me. I'm a big fan of, and sometimes I spend evenings browsing eBay or Osta.ee or some other platform like this and doing screenshots, because it's just crazy stuff that you see there. So let's do a small experiment. Do anybody tell me some kind of a word, and let's see what we get. Dog. That's crazy that you said dog, because you see, koer. I was looking up this the other day when I was preparing for this lecture, koer. But yeah, dog is a good one. So let's go and see what we get.
Sellest nali oligi.
Aha, okay. And already, I mean, you see very, at first you see like there's a random bunch of images, But then you see also images which make you kind of like, you know, when we talked earlier about this, you know, the web trash in a way or something like this. You see also something that is, you know, if you think of it from the designer's perspective, you know, that's bad design in a way. But if you look at it, you understand why it's done so. You know, they want to show as many possible of these dog uniforms that I can see, because maybe one of them will catch my eye and I want to buy it or whatever. So it's the same logic that we talked about, that the Filipino designers brought out. That why are these, you know, pamphlets in the Filipino or design scene, so to speak, so filled with information? It's because they want to use, you know, they want to take the maximum out of the paper that they have got. And yeah, so wow, you know, I mean, yeah, we could just browse it for an hour. But basically what I wanted to show is that look at this. It's crazy. Okay, getting back to here. So basically, what I wanted to say is that, you know, stock images, they have a very specific audience. You know, they're made for a very certain, with a very specific function in mind, and for very, you know, specific people to use. And if I don't fit into this category, then where do I get the images that I want, you know? And the eBay is one of the possibilities, actually. It's completely random, and it's completely, in a way, you know, it's very surprising the material you get there, and it quite often makes you perplexed. You don't really understand what they are, why some of these things are done. But anyway, but it's, I guess, and of course you don't have to agree, but it's rather obvious to see a similar function of, you know, templatization and this, you know, the function what you have in you know, stock collections, basically stock image collections. And maybe just one example of art practices as well that have been, you know, dealing with stock images or something like this. And this is the Disc Collective. Do you know it? You perhaps, did you watch it when you, when I send you the link? So basically this this images is a subset of this magazine, and this magazine used to be, it's now defunct. It doesn't, I'm not really sure, but I think, yeah, it doesn't function anymore. But it used to be like, you know, like a web magazine publishing maybe some news, some essays, interviews on contemporary art. And I don't even know what this means. Well, doesn't matter at the moment either. But the idea was that they were focused on basically web-based art, or not necessarily not web-based in that sense, that art that exists online, but art that in a way deals with topics deriving from web. But at some point they quit the magazine, and they made the first thing that they did, I think that was something like 2014 maybe, so quite a long time ago. These images that we just looked, which was a stock platform, alternative stock platform for images, they also a little bit later made this own, which is basically like a web shop. You can buy all that type of stuff here. Wonder what this is. Buy a tattoo. Yeah, and So that's what like an artistic practice where they try to engage with this stock model. Again, I'm not in a place to say how successful it is. Of course, commercially, it's not successful at all. I wonder if you read this this text that I sent you also in the PDF. Is an interview with an artist Ito Steierl, art historian Susan von Falkenhuysen, and this magazine people, two of them at least. And then they discuss several things, but among this they also speak about why they started making this stock platform and why they started, engaging in it. So if you're interested in, please take a read. Okie dokie. So we are in the end finally. And then just to sum up everything that I've said, or if we would come back to the initial question now, basically, so what is template culture? Then I would say it's a a big part of contemporary culture or contemporary zeitgeist, if you know the word, or mindset, and it has all the or derives from all the things that we talked about today, of standardization, of the ideas. I mean, of course, it's the very strong influence of it is the World Wide Web and the role it plays in the contemporary life. It's not a surprise to anyone that the World Wide Web plays a very big role in our lives nowadays, and it's something that derives from there. It's something that is in connection with how we interact with web-based material, how we have become to, in a way, take it for granted. Think of it as freeware, and all those things that I say are not, you shouldn't take them as 100% true. But I guess what I'm talking about is like tendencies in that, realm or form of living that we have, and maybe it's already clear because we had some examples previously. I myself, I don't think that all these, that music or movies or images or my own work, perhaps creative work in general, that it should be free. But at the same time, the thought how much I have to pay for something has changed a lot, and also the availability of it, has changed my mind towards it. So, and these are all the things that make up the template culture, but also, like we said, that we have these concrete examples of several templates, like mock-ups, stock materials, and web templates. But at the same time, you can see, the functionings of templatization, basically everywhere. The way we interact with the world. Be these like specific cases, like making memes or searching for images online, or be them more general, like we talked about standardization in general, that we're looking for these things.